Subcommittee of Trade for the Ways and Means Committee. Our hearing today is the global challenge of forced labor in supply chains, strengthening enforcement, and protecting workers. We thank everyone for joining us today. We're holding this meeting virtually in compliance with the regulations for remote proceedings. So let's go through the drill. We want to remind members of the procedures as we navigate the vote. First, consistent with the regulations, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Second, members and witnesses must have their cameras on when present in the hearing. If you need to step away from the proceedings, please turn your camera and audio off rather than logging out. Third, we'll dispense with our practice of observing the Gibbons rule and instead go in order of seniority for questioning, alternating between the minority and the majority, beginning with members of the Trade Subcommittee. I thank you all for your continued patience as we navigate this technology and continue serving our country together in a time of great need. And with that, I am pleased to turn to the topic of today's hearing, the global challenge of forced labor in supply chains, strengthening enforcement, and protecting workers. Today's hearing is the next step in our committee's ongoing work and leadership on forced labor issues. While Congress passed a law prohibiting the importation of goods made with forced labor nearly 100 years ago, it was generally unenforced and ignored after its passage. And sadly, that continues to be the case. There are some strong statements about being opposed to forced labor, but as we'll hear from our witness today, we've been a little shy in terms of actually getting results. I hope that we can continue our work to change that pattern. Part of what changed was the 2016 passage of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. It closed the so-called consumptive demand loophole that was baked in to the import prohibition and rendered it ineffective. If somehow there was a need for goods made with forced labor, we weren't going to be that concerned. Passage of that law was not a panacea. As often true in trade, it needed to be passed up with enforcement. I was pleased with the Obama administration's early efforts in this regard, and then deeply concerned when the enforcement fell off a cliff during the early parts of the Trump administration. In the last few years, enforcement has ramped up again, but we're still a significant distance away from enforcement actions that measure up to the scale and pervasiveness of forced labor around the world. The Department of Labor's latest report highlights forced or child labor in more than 75 countries and in more than 150 different products, many of which are used in everyday life across the United States. The purpose of our hearing today is to shine a light on some of these countries, regions, and sectors, to consider American enforcement efforts, and to discuss ways we can work with our trading partners and the private sector to cooperate on eradicating forced labor in our supply chains. I should also highlight the subcommittee held a hearing last September specifically on forced labor issues in Xinjiang. The testimony we heard that day and the continued press reports regarding the treatment of Uyghurs and other minority Muslim groups is deeply, deeply troubling. I remain committed to working with our colleagues to move forward legislation that would establish a stronger regime regarding imports coming from Xinjiang, and look forward to hearing from our witnesses regarding any updates they have on that situation. I'm also eager to hear from our witnesses, not just regarding China, but on the issue of forced labor that should be on the radar of this Congress. For instance, the committee has already played an active role in forced labor on palm oil plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia. I look forward to hearing an update on that situation on the ground and the effectiveness of CBP's enforcement actions to date. I'm also deeply interested in the prevalence of forced labor in the seafood industry. The Biden administration recently has taken some critical steps in this sector. Ambassador Tai made a significant proposal at the World Trade Organization to tackle this issue in ongoing fishing subsidies negotiations. And the CBP issued the first fleet-wide withhold release order earlier this summer, which I think is very significant. I'm interested to explore how we can continue to make progress in this area. Our witness testimony also highlights long frustration with the forced labor situation in the cocoa sector. I'm intrigued to hear from Ms. Ryerson about what effective enforcement strategy would look like in West Africa. I personally have an interest in forced labor in the sugar sector of the Dominican Republic. These issues have been on our radar for many years. A CAFTA complaint was filed, but conditions on the ground still appear to be deplorable. As we delve into issues of forced labor across all these regions and continents, it highlights the necessity of engaging with our trading partners to make real progress on this issue, but also with other governments and businesses. We want to focus on results, not just the form dealing with these challenges. I'm proud of our achievements with the renegotiated NAFTA on this front. Because of that agreement, we now have a continent-wide ban on forced labor imports. The key now is to make that ban effective. We've got a lot of work ahead of us to achieve that goal. We need to expand this cooperation to many other parts of our like-minded trading partners and make this a key part of our trade policy and international diplomacy. It's not enough for the United States to lead on this issue in form, but all of our allies and trading partners must do their part in terms of results. I think it'll be useful to consider the work being done in other countries as we consider how to buttress the strong import prohibition the United States has, along with other supportive policies. With that, I'll conclude my opening remarks and turn to Mr. Nunes.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. And thanks for holding this hearing. Our Trade Committee hearing last September focused on forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and shined a light on the atrocities Communist China is committing against its own people. Since 2017, China has arbitrarily detained and persecuted over 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in an extrajudicial mass re-education camps, subjecting them to forced labor, torture, political indoctrination, and other severe human rights abuses. We know that China is seeking to profit from the suppression by subsidizing companies that build factories near these mass internment sites. To combat these outrageous abuses, we must strictly enforce our ban on importing goods produced under these exploitative conditions. Today's hearing provides us with an opportunity to examine the prevalence of forced labor in other markets. I'm particularly concerned about the prevalence of forced labor in our agricultural supply chains, as well as the distant water fishing fleets that log millions of hours around the globe harvesting fish on the high seas. China's distant water fishing fleet is the world's largest, and the State Department has identified numerous incidents of forced labor on Chinese-flagged fishing vessels. On some of these boats, workers' identity documents are stolen. They are forced to work 18 to 22 hours a day. They are subject to verbal and physical abuse, and they are forcibly prevented from leaving the vessel. We must deny access to our enormous market for companies and countries that perpetuate these abuses. In 2016, this committee led the way on a bipartisan basis in eliminating the consumptive demand loophole from the outright ban on products made with forced labor in Section 307 of the 1930 Tariff Act. A few years later, we worked with our USMCA partners to extend the U.S. ban on goods produced with forced labor throughout North America. We're now leading the world in combating forced labor, and our customs officials must continue to effectively enforce Section 307 ban without harming the vulnerable communities it aims to protect. Nevertheless, we must consider whether additional legislation could help end this modern-day slavery. We must also consider how Congress and U.S. customs officials can better assist importers to proactively eradicate goods produced with forced labor from their supply chains. By protecting due process throughout the investigation and enforcement process, we can ensure that we strictly prohibit goods made with forced labor while helping importers to verify to customs officials that they are observing all relevant laws. This includes sharing best practices for documenting and mapping supply chains, as well as enabling importers to work with their suppliers to address labor rights violations. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for calling this important hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for taking their time to be with us today. And I look forward to hearing the testimony and the following questions. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Congressman Nunes. I deeply appreciate your comments. We'll note that you're standing in for Congressman Buchanan, who's ill. We wish him a speedy recovery and appreciate your helping us lead the effort here today.
I appreciate those kind words, and we will pass that on to Mr. Buchanan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll next hear from our panel. We want to thank our distinguished witnesses for taking time to appear before us today to discuss an issue that we feel deeply about. I'll introduce each witnesses, and in turn, each of them, we will turn for their testimony. Our first witness is Naya Mishra, Global Lead Migration and Human Trafficking at the Solidarity Center. Our second witness is Jennifer Rosenbaum, Executive Director for Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum. Our third witness is Charity Ryerson, Executive Director at the Corporate Accountability Lab. Our fourth witness is Genevieve LeBaron, Professor of Politics at the University of Sheffield. And our final witness is Brian Lowry, Senior Vice President for Innovation, Regulation, and Trade at the United States Council for International Business. Each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety, and I will say I found them to be very, very helpful. I would ask you that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less, and to help you with that, please note that there is a timer on the screen to help you keep track. If we're sliding over, I will gently tap to try and get us back on schedule. We will now turn to our first witness, Ms. Misra. Before you begin, I understand it's your son Kavi's birthday. We want to wish you well, have him extend our birthday greetings to him, and thank him for letting us spend some time with you on his big day. With that, Ms. Ra, you are on.
Thank you so much, Chairman Blumenauer, and that was a little unexpected, so I'm now you've made me a little emotional. Thank you so much. He'll be thrilled. Chairman Blumenauer.
And there's a
Congressman,
bike pin. There's a bike pin on his way to you for him.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That's really kind. He's 10 today, double digits, so it's very exciting. Chairman Blumenauer, Congressman Nunes, and members of the Subcommittee on Trade, thank you for the opportunity to present the Solidarity Center's perspective on how to strengthen enforcement and protect workers from forced labor and labor perpetrated by private actors, and these private actors are found throughout supply chains. We must acknowledge that eradicating forced labor in supply chains will require an approach that addresses discriminatory and oppressive systems and structures that are woven into the fabric of the global economy. There is no easy fix here. We will never eliminate forced labor until we deal with structural inequality, starvation wages, lack of decent work, and systems that deprive workers of agency and basic labor rights. I urge us at this hearing today to focus predominantly on the role that corporations play and the way that they set up their supply chains that make it very easy for forced labor to thrive. For example, is it really unforeseen that low-wage workers in sectors such as agriculture, fishing, and garment manufacturing are susceptible to forced labor when buyers and multinational corporations demand unrealistically low prices from suppliers, resulting in factories squeezing worker wages and demanding excess work hours to meet buyers' price requirements? The COVID-19 pandemic has shown a light on what we've known for decades about how these systems fail workers. For example, when the COVID pandemic hit and economies shut down around the world, buyers canceled contracts with suppliers. So in places like Haiti, garment workers who do not make a living wage in normal times received 2 weeks of half wages from the government and then nothing while their factories were closed or function at lower capacity. The buyers who source from these factories provide no safety nets for these workers. So Haitian garment workers reported to the Solidarity Center that just after 4 weeks, most workers had returned to their jobs sewing apparel for U.S. markets, traveling to work in overcrowded public transportation, and in some cases, sewing fabric masks for U.S. clothing brands while working without adequate safety equipment for themselves. Wage theft has also been rampant, wage theft, which is an indicator of forced labor, has also been rampant during the pandemic, increasing the vulnerability of low-wage workers, including migrants and other workers in export supply chains, to forced labor. The other thing that we see in the way that corporate supply chains are structured and the way that governments do not enforce standards in supply chains is that workers in sectors such as agriculture, garment manufacturing, seafood, and fishing work in sectors that are vastly underregulated and under-monitored. These sectors do not have strong adherence to core labor standards, and corporations do not put in place systems that force their suppliers to follow core labor standards. When we deny workers agency to have a say in their wages, working conditions, and to report workplace safety violations and exploitation, and we deny their access to remedies for such abuse, we allow conditions for forced labor to flourish. Similarly, we have set up global migration systems that make it very easy for migrant workers to fall into forced labor. For example, migrant workers are found all across supply chains, including in the sectors that I mentioned, such as agriculture, garment manufacturing, seafood, where forced labor predominates. These migrant workers are denied coverage under labor laws that would protect them. They're denied the ability to organize unions. For example, in Malaysia, where the CBP has issued a number of WROs in recent months, migrant workers in those sectors cannot form their own unions and therefore cannot stand up against the conditions that they see of forced labor. We cannot eliminate forced labor without fundamentally changing how companies do business and how governments monitor and enforce human rights and worker rights, and how labor migration is managed globally, without creating systems and structures that promote worker agency. From rubber plantations in Liberia to melon farms in Honduras, the Solidarity Center has seen time and again how democratic worker organizing and collective bargaining can eliminate forced labor in a workplace. I see that my time is done. I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rosenbaum, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Nunes, and members of the Trade Subcommittee. And I look forward to a time when we can be present together in person again. Forced labor on global supply chains is not an aberration or the choices of a few badly behaved contractors or supervisors. Forced labor is a predictable consequence of business models that profit from exploitation, governance gaps that rely on multinational corporations to police their own behavior through voluntary initiatives, and insufficient enforcement of laws that create market consequences for illegal supply chain actions. In other words, forced labor is rooted in choices made in boardrooms and governing halls, not just factories, farms, or fishing fleets. To meaningfully prevent forced labor on global supply chains, we must therefore similarly focus our efforts in those directions. Even with the increased Tariff Act enforcement following congressional action to remove the consumptive demand loophole, our experience shows clear gaps remain, which could undermine the Tariff Act Section 307's effectiveness as a tool to curb forced labor. Let me provide 3 examples of WROs issued in response to petitions filed in the sectors where we work. First, cotton. The first region-wide WRO was issued on cotton from Turkmenistan in 2018. However, we are unaware of any enforcement actions taken to date. Meanwhile, U.S. corporations, including Amazon, Walmart, Wayfair, and Overstock, continue to advertise and sell Turkmen cotton products. Second, palm oil. Lack of transparency on enforcement and troubling public statements by the importer leave us concerned that some products with tainted palm oil continue to reach the U.S. market, and that the 2020 WRO on Malaysian palm oil products sourced to Procter & Gamble could be lifted without sufficient independent evidence and remediation. Third, seafood. While the recent WROs on Taiwanese distant water fishing vessels, and for the first time on an entire Chinese fishing fleet, are an important step forward, enforcement will determine their impact. Meanwhile, the 2021 State Department Trafficking in Persons report disappointingly retained Taiwan in its high-level Tier 1 ranking. Now let me highlight a few key recommendations from the more comprehensive list included in my written testimony, many drawn from consultations with NGO and labor organizations that are part of TAG, the Tariff Act Advisory Group. First, we must increase the market consequences for multinational corporations and investors at the top of supply chains who rely on forced labor. This includes structuring WROs for maximum market impact up the supply chain and issuing conduct-changing penalties and fines to importers. Revenues from fines and fees should go to fund a worker emergency fund. This fund would protect workers who participate in exposing forced labor and are at the risk of losing their jobs due to a decision higher up the supply chain resulting in layoffs. Standards for modification and removal of existing or future WROs must be clear and independently verifiable, including by workers. Third, CBP and ICE should enact specific protocols for a swift response when workers face retaliation, including additional penalties for the corporate entities subject to the WRO. This is particularly important given the closing of civil society space and threats to labor rights defenders in multiple regions. Promotion of anti-discrimination and equity-based labor rights, including ending gender-based violence and harassment, also critically contribute to preventing forced labor. Forced labor conditions often take advantage of structural vulnerabilities of worker populations, including gender, race, caste, religion, and migration status. A key antidote to forced labor is freedom of association and assembly and the right to collective bargaining. Worker agency to monitor, report, and negotiate for decent work is fundamental to long-term change. This also includes increasing appropriations for US DOL's International Labor Bureau and the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. We have confidence in the experience of DOL Deputy Secretary Julie Su and ILAB Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs Thea Lee and their teams who understand what it takes to build capacity for workers, employers, and governments, and to combine enforcement, corporate accountability, worker protections, and worker power building. I would also like to add finally that we must look at the effectiveness of the CAFTA trade complaint mechanisms and the ineffectiveness given what we have learned from DR sugar and agricultural supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Ms. Ryerson, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Congressman Nunes, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to present testimony today on behalf of my organization, Corporate Accountability Lab. I'll focus on trafficked child labor in the cocoa industry in Cote d'Ivoire and forced labor on sugar plantations in the Dominican Republic. It's no secret that child trafficking has plagued the Ivorian cocoa sector for decades. Over the past 3 years, my organization has conducted regular investigations into child labor trafficking in the sector. And while I want to say that our findings are shocking, they're in fact just confirmation of so many other reports. Children are still offered money, goods, education, or otherwise deceived to board the bus from Mali or Burkina Faso to work on cocoa farms in Cote d'Ivoire. Although the Ivorian government closed the borders during the pandemic.
Mr. Chairman, I'm having difficulty hearing her. Could she get a little closer to the microphone?
Yeah,
Okay.
Sorry about that. Is this better?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I'll speak up a little louder. Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
So although the Ivorian government closed the borders during the pandemic, children did continue to be transported by motorcycle under cover of night. In fact, over 200 children have been rescued from trafficking and high-profile raids by the Ivorian police since the pandemic began. Once in the country, the old child trafficking structures kick in, and they're transported on regular bus routes to cities across the cocoa-growing regions, just as they have been for decades. When they arrive at their destinations, where they may not speak the local language, they face conditions of extreme isolation and engage in dangerous work. The vast majority of children working in the sector use sharp tools like machetes, they carry heavy loads, and they're exposed to agrochemicals. From my own experience in the cocoa growing regions, children engaged in these activities are such a common occurrence that it can be hard to tell who's trafficked and who isn't. Making this even more difficult, cocoa beans are commingled repeatedly across the supply chain, ensuring that nearly every kilo of cocoa coming into the United States from Côte d'Ivoire is tainted with forced labor. The real driver of forced labor in the cocoa sector is the unacceptably low price of cocoa that results in extreme farmer poverty. The chocolate industry doesn't pay a price that's sufficient to cover the cost of production and a living wage for cocoa farmers, and yet many of these companies are making billions in annual profits. Similar dynamics are on display in the Dominican sugar sector, where a Haitian workforce cuts sugarcane for export primarily to the US. These workers are often undocumented and live in remote housing called bateys, which are clusters of isolated, dilapidated, company-owned worker homes on dirt paths, in some cases with armed guards. There's hundreds of bateys in the Dominican Republic, both state and privately owned. Within the bateys, there are ubiquitous violations of labor rights that allow blatant forced labor to persist. Forced labor does not exist in a bubble. Where conditions are this poor and workers have no voice, slavery can hide in plain sight. CBP has a key role in addressing forced labor globally in all of its different forms. In some cases, a blunt tool like a WRO is exactly what's needed. In the Xinjiang case, the Chinese government and private companies have profited enormously off the prison labor of the Uyghur Muslim minority. In this context, we supported a regional WRO, as it would disincentivize persecution and incarceration. In contrast, a broad WRO against Ivorian cocoa would result in impoverished cocoa farmers losing access to an important market and what little income they have. In the two petitions that we have submitted to CBP on cocoa, we ask for a grace period to give companies one last chance to take remedial steps prior to CBP issuing a WRO. We don't suggest that CBP be lenient with companies that violate the law. To the contrary, we'd like to see more enforcement and larger penalties. But CBP should use its investigatory powers to push for greater transparency and proof that abuses have been remediated, responding flexibly to conditions on the ground to achieve outcomes that both address the underlying causes of forced labor and protect the most vulnerable supply chain workers. But CBP can't do this alone. One area where more activity would be welcomed is enforcement of the criminal provisions of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, a sorely underutilized tool. The US government has never prosecuted a company, nor has it invoked the extraterritorial provision of the TVPRA in a forced labor prosecution. We'd like to see nearly every WRO issued result in at least an investigation by the Department of Justice to determine whether a TVPRA prosecution was viable. Finally, civil liability is a key mechanism to deter undesirable behavior and provide remedy to victims, but current civil options are insufficient. We have to address the broader labor rights environment if we're ever to make real progress on forced labor. The Alien Tort Statute is one way to achieve this, allowing victims of egregious human rights abuses to bring claims in US courts, but a series of Supreme Court decisions, culminating in the recent decision in Nestle v. Doe, have largely closed this door. The Supreme Court has repeatedly punted this issue to Congress. While we would prefer a piece of legislation that creates civil liability for a broader range of extraterritorial harms committed by US companies in their supply chains, at a minimum, it's time for Congress to amend the Alien Tort Statute to provide for extraterritorial application. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Not a single prosecution. That's interesting. Professor LeBarn, you may begin now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Nunes. For 2 decades now, the United States government has positioned itself at the forefront of global efforts to fight modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced labor in the economy. Many US companies, too, have made voluntary commitments to ending forced labor, and they've long had policies in place that prohibit its use in their supply chains. These actions recognize that forced labor is a crime, that it is an abhorrent form of human rights abuse that has no place in modern business, that allowing some companies to profit through forced labor gives them an unfair advantage within the marketplace. And yet, a substantial body of research, including my own, reveals that forced labor remains an endemic part of 21st century supply chains and business models. For over a decade, I've been studying the patterns of forced labor in supply chains that feed US consumer markets. And in study after study, I've found workers subjected to physical violence and abuse, gender-based violence and rape, verbal abuse, threats against workers and their families, workers who are not paid the wages they are legally entitled to, workers who are forced to perform unpaid labor as a condition of their employment. These are all indicators of forced labor, and they're disproportionately experienced by workers who are women, who are racial and ethnic minorities, Indigenous peoples, and migrants, amongst other equity-deserving groups. Surrounding these workers, I've found well-established governance systems that are falling short. For instance, in one recent study I conducted of tea and cocoa supply chains, all 1,200 workers within my study reported some form of labor abuse. Tea and cocoa supply chains have been covered by well-funded, robust corporate social responsibility initiatives for 2 decades now. Many of the workers in my study were on tea plantations and cocoa farms that had been ethically certified by Fairtrade and Rainforest Alliance, sites that are audited by private social auditors and covered by voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives that seek to ensure goods and profits are produced without resorting to forced labor. The large companies at the helm of tea and cocoa supply chains report under anti-slavery legislation in the US state of California, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. But nevertheless, my research found forced labor to be widespread. Why? One key reason is that existing governance mechanisms largely fail to address the commercial incentives for forced labor. As brands and retailers source goods, they often hardwire demand for illegal labor practices into supply chains. Common business practices like sourcing below the true costs of production and the concentration of immense wealth and value at the top of supply chains simply don't leave enough money in the system for smaller businesses to cover the costs of labor laws and standards. Although forced labor often occurs in outsourced portions of supply chains, my research demonstrates that the large and powerful corporations that sit at their top, including brands, retailers, and financial firms, all bear sizable responsibility for forced labor in supply chains. There is an urgent need for the US government to hold these corporations accountable for how goods are actually being made and produced, and for the role that their commercial practices play in predictably giving rise to forced labor. We can no longer say that we don't know why, how, or where forced labor arises in supply chains. The patterns and the root causes are clear. Companies and governments know these crimes for what they are and know that current efforts to address them are falling badly short. And the question is whether and to what extent we care that corporations are systematically profiting from exploitation, and whether and to what extent they will be held accountable. Your leadership today is an opportunity to demonstrate that the US government's commitment to ending forced labor is matched by effective action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that's the watchword, is making sure that our good intentions and stated areas of transparency are actually realized. Now we'll turn to our next witness, Mr. Lowry. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Nunes, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Brian Lowry. I am the Senior Vice President for Innovation, Regulation, and Trade at the United States Council for International Business. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important topic. Our members are primarily US-based multinational companies and professional services firms spanning every sector of the economy, with global operations and supply chains touching every region of the world. Today, we propose operational changes to US Customs and Border Protection's current forced labor enforcement process that will further engage the business community in partnership with the government to eradicate forced labor from supply chains. We emphatically support efforts to prevent, identify, and eradicate forced labor globally. We applaud Congress's bipartisan commitment to ensure effective implementation and overall desire to achieve effective and efficient enforcement of Section 307 by Customs. Our member companies are deeply committed to eradicating forced labor in any form from their supply chains and devote significant time and resources to ensure that forced labor and other violations of core internationally recognized labor rights are not in their supply chains. We actively support the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and the International Labor Organization Tripartite Declaration of Principles Concerning Multinational Enterprises and Social Policy. We strongly advocate for the development of effective laws, regulations, and policies to eliminate forced labor linked to supply chains. Greater transparency by Customs upon initiation of an investigation and prior to the issuance of a withhold release order would enable the business community to partner with Customs to address forced labor and prevent the importation of prohibited goods. However, current Customs enforcement procedures create significant uncertainty, even when a supply chain is later proven to be clean. Our process recommendations would help address mistaken detentions by Customs for commodities not associated with enforcement actions. Specifically, we propose amending the current WRO process to create a multi-step approach. First, Customs would announce to all involved parties, including importers, when Customs determines an allegation merits investigation and provides companies with at least 60 days to respond to, or in appropriate circumstances, remediate the allegation. Customs currently accepts allegations regarding forced labor from a wide range of stakeholders through various means of transmission, but it does not accept, pre-WRO, any information from foreign governments or importers on the subject merchandise. Though Customs is required by regulation to consider information from a wide range of stakeholders, in practice it excludes any potentially involved entities from the process. Customs' current approach is contrary to its tradition of strong collaboration with industry. Second, Customs would issue a preliminary determination no less than 60 days after initiating an investigation and provide at least a 60-day comment period on the proposed WRO. Next, Customs would make a final determination on a WRO 120 days or more after initiating the investigation if it is determined after completion of an investigation and consultation with the existing Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. Involved parties should have at least 60 days to submit a remedy. Finally, Customs would issue a WRO. A graphic depiction of this proposal is in our testimony submitted for the record. We strongly believe that Customs must modernize, update, and align its regulations, policies, and procedures to address the evolving threat of forced labor and supply chains in partnership with the business community. Our proposed process will create a reasonable, transparent, and most importantly, an effective system for combating forced labor and supply chains. I appreciate the opportunity to provide our views on how to improve the WRO process via a more collaborative approach between Customs and the trade community, and more importantly, how to advance the effective enforcement of Section 307 by Customs. I welcome your questions and comments, and thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lowry. Without objection, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes to question our witnesses. We will not observe the Gibbons rule in this remote setting and will instead go in order of seniority, switching between majority and minority members. Members are reminded to unmute yourselves when you are recognized for 5 minutes. I will start by recognizing myself. And Mr. Lowry, I'd just like to follow up for a moment with some of your suggestions. I think those are worthy to explore. One of the concerns I have is that some of the transparency issues we have break down because supply chains are so deep, and it's not at the top or the first level, but there are multiple players. And in fact, there's some evidence in our testimony today that in some cases, people are forced to compete for contracts that are priced below the cost of compliance and the products, and that they are too far removed from people at the top who share our values and who check boxes and have transparency. But when you get down in the weeds to where the work is actually done and the exploitation takes place and the wage theft takes place, that it's very, very hard to control. Would you have any observations about how we go down 2, 3, 4 levels and make sure that the supply chain is not, and the business model is not, in fact, empowering forced labor?
Thank you.
Demanding it?
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Chairman. Human rights due diligence is a continuous effort that must address in advance as supply chains gain in complexity. And I agree 100% with what you said. We are into a very tiered approach of supply chains. I would say my experience has been that when you're dealing with first tier suppliers, you have great visibility and access to those suppliers, and you can check very closely their compliance with laws and their knowledge and engagement in compliance with US laws and regulations. When you get to the second tier, you may still have transparency and those relationships. But as you move to the third, fourth tier, global supply chains become more complicated, and businesses may need to go even deeper. They may need to institute more programs and observances and audits to get into that level of supply. Business is still working to gain full visibility from start to finish. Companies are working on programs and working to put them in place. And some members of USCIB have greater levels of visibility, but not all companies do. Technology may help as businesses expand their due diligence and go deeper into ever more complex supply chains. But I would offer this, Mr. Chairman, I would like to consult with our members directly. Not all sectors agree on the technology that's available, and the issue is complex, and I would welcome the opportunity to dialogue with your staff.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lowry. I would appreciate being able to do a deeper dive here. I am not unaware of the complexity of doing business in developing countries. I've watched it on the ground, looked at how this strays from what, as you go further down the supply chain, it's harder to have compliance. But that's how we're going to stop forced labor, and I would appreciate your further work with us. Ms. Ryerson, you described deeply disturbing conditions that have plagued the production of cocoa in West Africa, an example of this problem with the supply chain, and sugar in the Dominican Republic. You've been involved with this for years. Both supply chains exploit racial disparities among Afro-descendant laborers to meet the demands from the global north. Both agricultural products continue to be imported and widely consumed in the United States. And importantly, you suggest how enforcement approaches should be exercised and tailored to particular conditions and opportunities in the producing country. Could you please describe what kind of steps the United States government should or could take to remedy the egregious conditions that Haitian Dominican workers face in sugar plantations that will actually result in decent working conditions and livelihood for this particular population of vulnerable workers?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. The situation of the Haitian workers in the Dominican Republic is egregious and has been going on for a long time, and it's certainly the case that sugar companies are aware. How's my
Could
audio?
you once again get closer to your microphone?
Yeah, I apologize. How's this? Is this better?
A little bit.
Okay. So the situation in these bateys is very egregious, and the way that CBP could effectively intervene here does vary a little bit, again, from the Xinjiang cotton case. I think in some ways in agreement with Mr. Lowry, I think there is some opportunity for more flexible enforcement of CBP's mandate in a case like the Dominican sugar case. But overall, all companies that are sourcing from places where there is known forced labor that has taken place for many years and is well documented, those companies are aware of this and are aware when they're paying a price that's too low. So when we think about how we can most effectively intervene in sugarcane, but also in other industries like cocoa and others, CBP could play a role in pushing companies to pay a price that is adequate to produce the product that they're purchasing. So as we think about pre-WRO activities that CBP could take, it would be very interesting to see if through questionnaires, which they did issue in the cocoa case, they issued questionnaires to about 25 cocoa importers and exporters from West Africa to look for supply chain transparency and due diligence compliance and copies of social audits. And so when you see these kinds of interventions in supply chains, the industry sees that they're going to need to turn over the kind of information that might allow CBP to make an accurate assessment and to issue tailored WROs. But also it pushes the industry to obtain transparency where they don't have it, to find information that should be within their control and that no one else has access to, and make that information available at least to CBP. We'd like to see more public transparency. We think that that would make a big difference in identifying exactly which instances of forced labor result in imports into the United States in violation of the statute. And that's something that I think we have a long way to go on.
Thank you very much. The challenge of the global fisheries industry has bedeviled those of us who care deeply about international trade, about strip mining the oceans, about piracy, forced labor, the health. The vast majority of our seafood in the United States is imported, and it's caught under very questionable circumstances. We've, as a committee, have been following this. We've seen some aggressive actions at the beginning of the Biden administration. It's clear we need, obviously, to continue taking action. To build on this momentum, what action, Ms. Rosenbaum, would you suggest be taken to ensure that we keep making progress in the seafood sector?
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer. And I agree, we have made some progress and we need quite a bit more. As you highlighted, the United States imports approximately $2.4 billion worth of seafood imports derived from illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And that's about 11% of total US seafood imports. And that number rises when we look at imports that are caught at sea. So this is an egregious situation. I think we would like to see more and broader WROs designed with market impact. So fleet-wide, specifically fleet-wide WROs. WROs on a particular boat are not going to be as effective. We support the USTR's 2019 decision to revoke trade preferences for Thailand based on labor rights issues. However, tuna, one of the seafood products most associated with forced labor, is not covered under Thailand's GSP program, which has limited that impact in pressuring seafood exporters. The Seafood Import Monitoring Program needs to be expanded. It currently only covers about 13% of the varieties coming in. Europe is tracking 100% now, so we know we could get there. It's very important to track everything that's coming in at the borders. Otherwise, we can't know if it's reaching the market. And finally, I think TIP rankings from the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office need to be consistent with WROs. So Thailand was downgraded, but Taiwan retained its high markers despite the existing WROs.
Thank you very much. I hope that this is an area that the committee can pay more attention to. We made significant progress with international negotiations back when we were looking at TPP. There seemed to be a consensus that was developing, and I hope we can build on this. It is urgent for not just forced labor, but a whole host of other issues. Mr. Nunes, you're recognized to inquire if you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'll go to Mr. Lowry. And you testified that USCIB and its members have worked for decades to develop corporate due diligence programs that target and eliminate forced labor from their supply chains. And I think it'd be helpful for the committee if you could maybe walk us through and describe some of these programs and the challenges companies face implementing them.
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Nunes, Congressman Nunes, and I appreciate your paying such close attention to the testimony. With respect to human rights generally, there are numerous examples of where members have worked to develop innovative corporate due diligence programs. Partnerships between business and civil society for audits, training, sharing of information, and advancement of remedies is just one. And I've seen that firsthand in the cotton fields in India. Additionally, companies have instituted in-person training programs for suppliers and vendors in high-risk areas, covering labor rights and anti-corruption. As for challenges, one particular challenge that comes to mind is the disregard for contractual obligations that suppliers accept readily, but to which they do not adhere. And the enforcement of those provisions put businesses into a position of deciding to either cut and run, or to work to enforce those provisions and ensure that the suppliers honor them. Human rights due diligence, as I said earlier, is a continuous effort that must adjust in advance as supply chains gain in complexity and as adjustments are made. And I have more examples that I could share, but I'm conscious of the clock and I don't want to occupy your entire time.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think we need to look more into what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I really appreciate your testimony here today and your work on these issues, because there's really no daylight between our parties on this issue, because we need to strengthen our legal regime and combat forced labor all over the globe. And there's longstanding problems with forced labor, and I think Chairman mentioned rice farms all over Africa, sugar plantations in Asia, and the fishing issue is one of great interest all over the globe. You hear those complaints from many of our allies and around the world about this continued problem of Chinese fishing. So, and then of course the forced labor problem in China with the Uyghurs. It's very inhumane, and it's political repression of ethnic minorities, religious ethnic minorities, by the communist regime in China. So, Mr. Lowry, thank you for that testimony. But I'm going to turn to Ms. LeBaron, because I know you focused on China a little bit. And could you maybe talk about how our allies are engaging with the Chinese government? If you have any information on that, I think it would be helpful for the committee to hear.
Thank you, Congressman. The way governments have been acting to address forced labor in recent years primarily takes place through transparency legislation, where they've tasked companies of a certain size to report on the efforts that they're taking to detect and address forced labor in their supply chains. There's been some concerted effort recently around the challenge that many garment companies continue to source from the region in spite of known risks of forced labor. And overall, we can see that while this legislation is really raising a lot of awareness, there's been a lot of disclosure and a lot of reporting, but it hasn't actually changed much. And we can see that, I think, especially in the case of ongoing sourcing from China.
Well, thank you, Ms. LeBaron and Mr. Chairman. A lot more work needs to be done on the supply chain issue. I'm glad that you're focusing on it, and I know that you're going to have bipartisan support on this investigation on the supply chain issue. It's very, very critical. So thanks for holding this, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nunes, and I agree with you. I think this is an area where there's probably not any daylight in terms of where most of the committee members are in both parties. This is a bipartisan priority, and I look forward to working with you, your Republican colleagues, and the rest of the committee to make real progress dealing with these very difficult issues. Let me turn next to Congressman Kind.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for your terrific testimony here today, but it's such an important issue, and I couldn't agree more. There's strong bipartisan support in Congress to do more, to crack down on the exploitation of forced and child and slave labor throughout the globe. And to the point that's been raised a couple of times already, I had a meeting with members of the European Parliament this morning, in particular Bernd Long, who's the head of their trade committee, about forced labor issues and the need for greater coordination and collaboration between the US and EU in dealing with this on a global basis. And there's great interest, obviously, across the pond, as they say, in enhanced coordination. But Ms. Rosenbaum, let me start with you with the question. Back in 2015, I led the effort along with Chairman Blumenauer, other members of the committee, to close down the consumptive demand loophole that existed in our Trade Enforcement Act in order to get CBP to be more effective in enforcing the exploitation of child and slave and forced labor. Since that time, again, because of some pressure that we put on CBP, there has been some additional WROs being issued. And with Mr. Kilby's lead, we had a WRO on a polysilicon company operating in the Xinjiang region of China recently. But from your perspective, how well is CBP doing after we've closed down that consumptive demand loophole? And are they resourced enough for the demand that exists for further enforcement in this area?
Thank you, Congressman Kind, for the question, and also to you and other members of Congress for that important action in 2016, closing the consumptive demand loophole. My organization advocated for that, and we saw that there was a 10-year period prior to that where no WROs were issued. And since that time to the present, CBP has issued over 30 WROs and has started to innovate in WROs that have market impact, including regional WROs, fleet-wide WROs, et cetera. So I think we definitely see very important steps forward. And at the same time, the WRO issuance is the first step. And what really matters after that is what imports are stopped, what changes happen for workers on the ground, and how do we know when that's happening and how do we keep it up? I think there are some encouraging anecdotal reports that we're hearing where wages have gone up for workers, where their passports have been returned, and conditions are, recruitment fees have been repaid. These are very important, and at the same time, it's critical as CBP is either modifying or removing those WROs that there is communication with independent information and workers about whether that remediation is effective and working, and we're not solely relying on corporate due diligence.
Ms. Rosenbaum, as we look downstream a little bit with the Trade Enforcement Act coming up for reauthor, any suggestions? Has your group been focusing on enhanced enforcement tools that we can be thinking about right now?
I think that we can look to the USMCA as a model. I think, again, that is still in its early days, but we are seeing the actions of the administration as likely to be impactful. We also appreciate Representative Tai's advocacy at the WTO, connecting the IUU fishing and forced labor issues strongly.
Okay, thanks. We'll look forward to working with you. Mr. Ryerson, let me ask you, I went over on a bipartisan trip to Cameroon before COVID hit. Part of it was dealing with the Anglophone conflict in the region, but also the forced labor in the cocoa section of West Africa. In a lot of these areas where there's especially exploitation of child labor, usually it's a tough domestic situation. Does that hinder our ability to go in and do good investigative work to expose the forced labor conditions in a situation like the Anglophone region of Cameroon or other parts of West Africa?
Thank you for that question. I think it is certainly the case that in any country where forced labor exists, there is a local rule of law problem. That's pretty universally true. And working with local governments can be very difficult. And certainly in West Africa, in the cocoa sector, this is no different. At the same time, I think this is part of why we can focus a little bit on corporate behavior or the way that purchasing practices are leading to forced labor in supply chains, just because there's only so much that we can do with participation of local governments, although there is a role for them and they should not be removed or replaced by private actors. That is just sometimes a limited role for funding political will and other reasons.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the hearing today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congressman Kind. And you're raising an issue that I hope we'll be able to do a little deeper dive. Perhaps Mr. Lowry can help us to be able to focus on business practices that we might be able to identify and change that ripple down through that supply chain. Congressman Rice. Highway 73.
Yes, sir, and we need that road very badly. I'm all for the infrastructure package. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this very important hearing. It really is important, and we need to do what we can to make sure that people are not exploited. But I want to talk about some more practical aspects on American workers and the effect of labor exploitation abroad and the effect on American workers. And the nameplate on my desk says jobs, jobs, jobs. And I have Myrtle Beach in my district, which is a nationally known tourism area, the Grand Strand. But I also have the PD, which is agriculture and textiles. 30 years ago, it was agriculture and textiles. And now I have a lot of mills in my district that parking lots are growing grass instead of full of cars and people producing textiles. And we hear a lot of cries about income disparity in this country, but when companies they use information technology and transportation technology to globalize and then exploit labor, Mrs. Ryerson, can you tell me what the effect of that is on American workers?
Great, thank you so much for that question. We last fall submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court on behalf of 19 ethical chocolate and cocoa companies, many of which were based in the United States, making the argument that civil liability for companies that import goods produced with forced labor should exist. And so the idea is that it creates unfair competition with our local companies, with workers here in the United States.
So if the companies, the people at the head of those companies, if they move their production overseas, are they affected?
Right.
No, the people at the top are not affected, right? Who is affected?
Yeah, well, for one, there's a Hawaiian cocoa industry that's affected. So I think we do have.
So it's the workers, right? It's the workers. It's the people at the low end of the chain that are left out, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you can see that across industries.
I'm sorry, I have so limited time.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, sir.
Mrs. LeBaron, do you agree with that? How are American workers affected? People who used to work, for example, in a textile plant in Marion, South Carolina, how are they affected by forced labor for apparel in China?
I think it's fair to say they're adversely affected, but that also forced labor does take place on American soil and in large parts of the prison industry, especially around agriculture. So
right.
Mrs.
Misra, American shrimpers that operate out of Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, how are they affected by illegal fishing in China?
Congressman Rice, I think your point is very important, that there needs to be a level playing field around the world where all workers have access to core labor standards and decent work, so that we don't have this unfair competition of producers abroad being able to produce goods more cheaply because they rely on forced labor. And so that does affect U.S. workers.
And Mrs. Rosenbaum, how are American farmers in the PD in South Carolina, where cotton is one of their #1 crops, how are they affected by forced labor in the cotton industry in Turkestan, I think is where y'all said the problem was?
Well, I appreciate that question. And as someone from Memphis, Tennessee, I certainly think a lot about cotton and cotton workers. They are negatively affected, as are all workers, when corporations are producing with forced labor. And I think we have to remember that the profits are going to U.S. executives and investors, and that promoting labor rights broadly.
Mrs. Rosenbaum, this is obvious to me, and I'm sure obvious to you, but I want you to answer this for the benefit of people who it's not so obvious to. If you exclude the American worker and you replace them with people who are enslaved labor or exploited labor, how does that affect income disparity in the United States?
I think that obviously having a good job, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay for a fair day's work is what all workers everywhere around the world.
So the corporate executive, his pay goes up because his labor cost goes down because he's exploiting people in China, right? So his income goes up, but the people who had that textile job in Marion, South Carolina, or the shrimp boat captain in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, or the cotton farmer in in Florence, South Carolina, their income goes away. And what does that do to income disparity? It grows, correct?
Yes, I think the global supply chain model has increased income
So
disparity.
thank you for that. And just to finish up, China has proven that they will cheat in every aspect. They've proven that they will steal from us. They have proven that they will exploit labor. They have proven that they will do these things until they're forced to stop. And we've come a long way with China in forcing them to the table. And I hope that the Biden administration will continue that forceful approach to bring forced labor issues to rest and other issues with China to rest. And I worry about the relationship of the Biden family with the Chinese government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No.
I yield back.
Thank you very much. Congressman Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Working conditions and forced labor have long been concerns of mine from a personal vantage point, not only for Americans, but for people all over the world. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. And I also want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony today. Our experiences here in the United States with slave labor and other forms of forced labor has demonstrated the profound and lasting scars those practices leave on economic, social, legal, and governmental institutions and practices. History makes clear that the notion that time will heal those wounds without empowerment of those who've been exploited and oppressed to organize and build social and economic structures and seek equity and justice is naive at best, Ms. Mesra, as you say in your testimony. Congress, the executive branch, other governments, and multinational corporations should ensure freedom of association, the right to organize, join trade unions, and collectively bargain for all workers regardless of status or nationality in both origin and destination countries. Freedom of association must be assured in practice, not just law. And as you state further, all workers, whether national or foreign, documented or undocumented, must have equal and full protection of the law. In addition, governments and employers must recognize and enforce all ILO core labor standards, including the freedom of association and the right to organize. Ms. Mesra, could you share a bit more of your views that Congress can use and actions that we might take to be more effectively engaged in reducing these practices and bringing them not necessarily to a halt, but certainly to a different level in many of the countries that we are engaged?
Thank you so much, Congressman Davis, for the question. And I think first and foremost, we need to recognize the importance of worker agency in terms of eliminating forced labor in supply chains. And what this means is that we need to empower workers to monitor their own workplaces and demand better working conditions and access to justice. One way that Congress can do that is through making sure in trade agreements that we put forward the idea of freedom of association all along the supply chains and require governments to ensure that, as you said, workers, regardless of status, regardless of industry, have access to the right to organize and collectively bargain. And I can give you example after example, but just one to use. In Liberia, there's one of the world's largest rubber plantations that is owned by Bridgestone Tire Company. And for decades, workers were in forced labor there because of high quotas that they had to meet, low daily wages, etc. When the workers stood up and had a wildcat strike and got rid of their yellow union and actually had a democratic and independent union, they were able through collective bargaining to get rid of the conditions that created forced labor for them. This is the best way to do this. The last thing I'll say on this, Congressman Davis, is that corporations create systems such as third-party auditors, certification systems, etc., as ways to limit worker agency and freedom of association. And we've, as Professor LeBaron has said, they don't work. And so we need to institute programs, including for migrant workers, by the way. When you mentioned in your opening remarks the legacy of slave labor, we're seeing brown and black workers around the world who migrate across borders to work in these low-wage sectors, who are now being put in modern forms of slavery and conditions of forced labor. And we need to address that from a racial discrimination perspective, but also a worker agency perspective.
Thank you very much. And Professor LeBaron, could you respond to the same question?
Yes, Congressman, thank you very much. Would you just share the question one more time, please?
What is it that Congress might do that would more effectively reduce or help put a halt to these practices?
Thank you. I think that Congress needs to make business models configured around forced labor unviable and unprofitable. And they can do so by effectively making the likelihood of prosecution very high for the businesses who use forced labor, and ending the culture in which it can take place with virtual impunity.
Thank you very much, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for a very important hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Davis, and that's a fascinating point. What we can do to make sure that we don't allow a business model that is in fact implicitly based on forced labor. There are areas here that I think we can explore that we ought to be able to make that less likely or hopefully impossible. Congressman LaHood.
Well, thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Nunes, for holding this important hearing today. I also want to just acknowledge the witnesses for their valuable testimony here today on this really important topic. I continue to be a strong advocate that we cannot allow forced labor to prosper, and we must do all we can to prevent and penalize these unacceptable practices across the globe. And we've heard many examples here today. While the United States leads the world in preventing forced labor, we must also support efforts that promote American values, including actively participating in robust trade policy and supporting trade agreements to help stem the use of forced labor practices. I've continued to work to bring attention to these issues through the work on the Trade Subcommittee, but also as the co-chair of the bipartisan U.S.-China Working Group and as a member of the GOP China Task Force. As we look at ways to increase clarity and transparency for U.S. companies that work diligently to go above and beyond international standards to combat against forced labor in global supply chains, we should focus on concrete ways we can help U.S. companies be effective. Looking particularly at goods coming from China, I recognize there are challenges with the required documentation under Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930. And I know we've heard a little bit about that today. I guess I want to ask the witnesses if they could talk about ways in which Section 307 regulations could be updated to provide more effective guidance for companies to utilize as it relates to China. And maybe I'll start with Mr. Lowry and then go to Ms. Ryerson.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think it is absolutely critical that we look at the current regulations and the way in which they are enforced to consider what works and what doesn't. We've heard a number of examples and a number of comments today about things that aren't working and things that aren't happening. but I think we can find a workable solution to help address this. I think one thing that my testimony also supported was that you enroll business as a partner in doing this. If business is in the middle of this mix, then business will also be in the middle of the solution. And I think I would encourage further discussion about this, to look to business as a partner and to have a process that contributes to fact-finding, that is collaborative and transparent, that is understandable for all engaged and inclusive. And most importantly, advance the shared objective that we've all shared today of eradicating forced labor in supply chains. Thank you.
And thank you for your question. I would just add to that, I actually agree with Mr. Lowry on many of his points about creating this multi-step process. And I think some of what he's speaking to is the same transparency aims that a lot of us on civil society are asking for. We're looking for CBP to provide a lot more information throughout the process to us so that we can use that information in our investigations and in order to tailor what information we're providing to them. So that greater transparency, I think, is a desire across the board. I do think that having some flexibility depending on the industry, when we're looking at China specifically, and particularly in the case of incarcerated workers, any kind of prison labor, whether it's an internment camp, a concentration camp, or a prison, probably that deserves a straight up WRO right out the hatch. I'm not sure that we need a multi-step process and a lot of hand-wringing. That's something where those goods really should not be coming into the United States and competing unfairly with domestically produced goods or other goods produced in other parts of the world that were not produced with such practices. In other industries like the cocoa sector, as I mentioned, more flexibility is important. And so in those cases where we could have a multi-step process, like what Mr. Lowry was identifying, with the recognition that the cocoa companies are fully aware of the problem and have failed to solve it for so many years, I do think that could be a helpful update to the regulations.
Well, thank you both for your responses on that. As a follow-up, Ms. Ryerson, as it relates to China, I think we all saw the horrible pictures last year, the year before, of looked like a concentration camp in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and the way that they have been treated. But I guess what gives you any optimism that the Chinese are making changes or acknowledging? You can't even get them to acknowledge that this is a problem or an issue. And they continue to deny that. And so have you seen any changes on behalf of the Chinese government that gives you hope or optimism that we're making headway here?
I think there's a real lack of information coming out of the region, which has been a problem for all of us. But at the same time, it is a fact that if you dry up a market for forced labor produced goods, there will be less goods produced with forced labor. So we don't know if there's been an immediate impact in terms of releasing incarcerated religious minorities in China. We do hope that over time, this type of loss of a market will create different incentives on the Chinese government that will address this practice.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Next, we will turn to Dan Kildee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this really important hearing. This is a subject that obviously we are all very much focused on. I sure have. And I know Mr. Kine made reference in his questions to some of the work that I've been doing on polysilicon, and I want to follow up on that. A lot of workers in my district have been hurt by these forced labor, slave labor practices. China is a global leader on the production of polysilicon, which is a necessary input for solar cells. A Michigan company, Hemlock Semiconductor, competes directly with these Chinese companies in this highly skilled manufacturing sector. And of course, there's overwhelming evidence that Chinese polysilicon companies benefit from the use of slave and forced labor in Xinjiang. The Chinese government's human rights abuses against the Uyghur people, including forced sterilization, family separation, forced labor, these are just shocking. And I'm pleased that they've been so much a subject of the focus of our committee and of the witnesses. They're completely unacceptable practices. And so we all have to speak out against these terrible behaviors. But there's also a real world economic implication for American workers. As I said, people I represent are being impacted by this. As a result of artificially low costs in China, Hemlock Semiconductor, employing people in my district, have had significant impact. They've been unable to compete, and they've had to lay off workers. 50 families that I represent just recently lost what was a career for these workers. And so we can't just sit idly by while China commits human rights violations that not only shock the conscience, but have the effect of hurting American workers. U.S. law, as we know, and has been alluded to in this hearing, prohibits the importation of goods made with forced labor. So I was very proud to work with Chairman Neal, with Chairman Blumenauer, with Mr. Pascrell, in writing a letter in June asking the Biden administration to take aggressive action to prevent the importation of products from Xinjiang made with forced labor. And within a week of sending that letter, the administration did respond and took action to do just that. And so while I'm pleased with the administration, happy that they've taken this important step, there's a lot more that can be done. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, for example, through pressure that came from some of those same members, some of us.
Dan, is it possible to wrap up here?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Did I go 5 minutes already?
That's what I think the timer said, but finish your thought.
I don't believe I've done 5 minutes yet.
Okay, well then keep going.
Yeah, it's only been a couple minutes. But anyway, let me just ask my question then. There's something wrong with the timer.
No.
Clearly, I mean, I've been watching the clock. If I could ask Ms. LeBaron, the U.S. alone can't completely address these violations, especially with a country as large as China. And I wonder if you could just touch on how we can engage our allies to address forced enslaved labor in China and other countries around the world.
Thank you, Congressman. I think, you're right. The WROs are happening now, and as action heats up, we need to be studying the impacts in real time. We need to be looking at how, these import bans are shaping the prevalence of forced labor, and we need to be able to measure that ourselves, as well as looking at how that might intersect with or be complemented by other efforts that other countries are taking. I think, you mentioned Europe. One of the important things that's happening in Europe at the moment is the development of mandatory due diligence legislation that will help promote corporate accountability. And that's something that I think the United States could do well to work with Europe on, and to ensure that that doesn't become just another tick box exercise, but has a really strong instrument and meets the required standard of care to really give business a nudge into doing the things they need to do to make sure forced labor doesn't happen in their supply chain.
I yield back.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Sorry if there was confusion on the timing. I apologize. You're the last person we would want to shortchange.
It doesn't happen often.
Oh, yeah, you're darn right. Congressman Arrington. Let's go to Congressman Panetta. Jim?
Mr. Chairman, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Let's go to Jim. Let's go to Congressman Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our panelists here today. In the past, we've worked in bipartisan manner to pass legislation that combated some of this serious issue dealing with forced labor. In 2016, the committee took the crucial step to ban imported goods made with forced labor through the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. and in 2018 with passage USMCA. We did a lot to help from America's standpoint on combating forced labor. But the problem with slave labor still exists, and in some cases it seems to be growing. The reality is in that many industries across the globe, forced labor is used in some way or another, whether it's agriculture, textiles, or even manufactured goods. Odds are that the supply chain's been corrupted with the practice in some way. The Department of Labor keeps a list of countries believed to produce goods through child labor, and as of last month, it included 77 countries and 156 different goods. There's far too few countries around the globe that are working to halt forced labor and making that a priority. And with our modern supply chains being so complex and non-transparent, it's extremely difficult for authorities and consumers to know whether a good's been produced through criminal labor. But as the leading consuming country in the world, we need to take an active stance and hold the bad actors responsible. We can't turn a blind eye to certain repeat offenders just because they're part of a large trading nation. For example, evidence shows that the Chinese Communist Party now operates large-scale state-sponsored programs of forced relocation and labor for certain ethnic minority groups. It appears that when the Chinese communists deem problematic people, they're being transferred into factories across China, meaning most of the largest supplier of garments and other manufacturing goods at risk of being used forced labor. It's time to make clear to the Communist Chinese Party that they can no longer profit off of an economic system that monetizes some of the most egregious rights violations in the world. In light of some of these severe abuses from China, I think it's questionable should they even be rewarded hosting a major international event like the Olympics in 2022, particularly when it's clear that they don't show any sign of stopping these horrendous rights abuses. Recently, some notable U.S. companies have performed audits on their supply chain, and in some cases subsequently removed and changed locations that had been found to be using criminal labor practices. I think efforts like this should be applauded and encouraged. Companies refusing to source products from any region or country known to use forced labor will go a long way towards removing the blight of forced labor from the global economy. Mr. Lowry, can you talk a little bit about some of the specific activities that the U.S. can do working with U.S. companies to ensure that the supply chain is free of criminal labor activity?
Sorry, Congressman, I had myself on mute. My apologies for that. Well, I think the proposal that we put forward in our written submission, as well as what I outlined in my testimony, is one such step that the U.S. could take, and that is to involve business earlier in the WRO process. Oftentimes, when the WRO is issued, business doesn't find out until hours before it is issued and it's about to hit the point.
At AG, but he is back.
And there's a lack of visibility, and the importer's goods are already at the port or they're already on the water by the time we become aware of that. And so business gets faced with a limited opportunity here to either re-export the shipment once it arrives or provide proof to get the shipment released and entered into U.S. commerce. If companies had more notice, they could, for example, stop payment, cancel the order, and use the power of the purse, which we've heard so much about today, to effectuate that change. When a company is left with no options for goods they have paid for and cannot import, companies will stop working with the supplier and cut and run, versus pressuring their suppliers to be a good actor in a bad neighborhood. And so I think some process improvements where you could engage the business community at an earlier stage would give them the opportunity to address situations with suppliers to eradicate some of these forms of forced labor that are so difficult to get at because of where they're occurring in the supply chain.
Oh, that's great. With some of the technology advances that our Customs and Border Patrol has today, hopefully that can some of those good ideas can be implemented throughout the shipping process. So I appreciate the hearing we're having today, Mr. Chairman, and it's a very important topic, and I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. We value your questions and look forward to working with you. Now, consistent with committee practice, we will now move to a 2-to-1 ratio for questioning, starting with Congressman Panetta, who's somehow able to testify in 2 hearings simultaneously. Jimmy, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Just don't say that too loud. But I appreciate this opportunity, and thanks to all the witnesses. I want to talk about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, otherwise known as IUU fishing. As many of you know, and I think has been talked about this on this hearing, because I was listening to this hearing as well, that IUU fishing vessels often hire many migrant workers who are vulnerable to abuse. And I want to direct your attention to an article in The Economist, which is basically my Bible, to be honest with you, because they have excellent articles and excellent writing. The October 24th, 2020 edition. And I want to share a couple of pieces from this article on IUU fishing. Basically says, it starts off talking about, goes through a number of issues, and then it hits on forced labor. And it says, in Asia, forced labor is rampant. Thailand has a huge fishery, but few Thais want to join it, leaving the fleet short of about 50,000 seamen a year. Tens of thousands of migrants from Cambodia and Myanmar are then whispered into Thailand each year to make up the numbers. Then it gives a great description. The author mentioned one of these boats, and he gives a great description. I want to share it with you. He says, your writer joined a vessel that fished about 100 miles off the Thai coast. 36 Cambodian men and boys worked barefoot in 15-foot swells on a deck made slippery by fish guts and ice, an obstacle course of jagged tackle and spinning winches. One boy proudly showed off 2 missing fingers caught between a net and a drum. Some crew members' hands had open wounds, the deepest of which they stitched up themselves. The captain had plenty of amphetamine to distribute, but no antibiotics. Shifts ran up to 20 hours. Food was once daily bowl of rice flecked with boiled squid. Drinking water was rationed. The whole ship crawled with cockroaches. Rats were as carefree as city squirrels. I think this is a good example of the conditions, but also what can happen when IUU comes into play, especially in certain parts of our world, especially over in Asia. Now, Ms. Misra, I know you haven't had an opportunity to answer a couple questions, so I want to ask you, what connection does IUU fishing have to forced labor on fishing vessels? If you can go into that a little bit more, but more importantly, what can we do? What can the United States do to reduce IUU fishing and therefore, I believe, reducing forced labor in fishing?
Thank you so much, Congressman Panetta. And as Chairman Blumenauer also said, the fishing industry is so important in our conversation of eliminating forced labor and supply chains. 2 points to what you said. The first, the workers on these fishing vessels, as you noted, are predominantly migrant workers. And one of the issues, one of the reasons they're so susceptible to forced labor in those supply chains is because of the way migration is legally managed in Asia and other places where we see large numbers of migrant workers on fishing vessels. They're often required to pay large recruitment fees for the privilege of doing these dangerous and dirty jobs. These recruitment fees put them into debt bondage. The pricing structures, as Ms. Ryerson spoke of earlier, that the buyers who buy from these suppliers have very unrealistic pricing structures. And so the suppliers rely on forced labor to meet those pricing structures. And then the last point I'll make is the under-regulation of this sector. As we've been talking about increasingly in IUU fishing, we've been talking about safety regulations, environmental regulations, but labor regulations are few and far between. If we can use technology to track the fish, we can use technology to track the shipping vessels, to track the workers who are on those fishing vessels, the buyers who are buying from those suppliers. We need to utilize the same technology that we're talking about for the environment and for safety regulations to track workers' conditions. Thank you.
And you must have read this article as well, because it's exactly what they go into as one of the solutions, and talking about using technology to track these quote unquote dark fleets that they call them, especially out of China, that goes all the way across the Pacific Ocean, pretty much right off the coast of the Galapagos as well. At least when quoting those international waters that are right there, go right up to it. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I only got 16 seconds left, so I'm going to yield my time back. But thanks to all the witnesses, and I appreciate your testimony on this very important topic. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Congressman Panetta. That article was chilling, to say the very least, and I look forward to working with you in the committee on making progress there. Next, we have Congresswoman Delbene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for holding this incredibly important hearing. I wanted to start up and follow up Ms. Rosenbaum on the conversation that we've been having about the impact of withhold release orders, WROs, and the challenges that we face if we are only acting in a unilateral way. I wondered first if you could comment on what evidence exists to show that the US WROs have or have not decreased forced labor so far.
Thank you, Congresswoman. That's a really important question. And this is a strategy that is evolving, and we do need more information, as many of my co-panelists have mentioned earlier. We need comprehensive and transparent data on the actual enforcement efforts after the WROs are issued. We do know that the WROs bring significant financial and legal risk for companies that engage in or tolerate forced labor on their supply chains, and that this also has a deterrent effect and incentivizes better practices. And experience shows that that is necessary. These are supply chains that we're talking about today where the acknowledgement of forced labor has been there for decades, and yet corporations on their own accord have not cleaned up these supply chains. They're making business choices to complexify as opposed to simplify. And in a complex supply chain, the investment must be made to track and acknowledge it. We do also know that blocking market access can be extraordinarily effective in changing labor practices and ending forced labor. And in our cotton campaign work in Uzbekistan, we've seen that when significant market access was limited, both governments and civil society actors and businesses were able to come together around creative, responsible sourcing agreements. And we're very hopeful that there can be a real transformation of that sector as an example.
Thank you. And you were talking about the added power that we have if we do things in a multilateral way. And I wondered if you could talk about your thoughts on how we might construct new provisions, either in a trade or other multilateral agreements that would allow us to have a more coordinated import prohibitions on goods that are made with forced labor, or other policies that we could have that might go along with an import ban to really ensure that we're making progress here and providing assistance to the folks who, the forced laborers in this process.
Thank you for that question. And I think reciprocity is not automatic among countries. So obviously the transshipment issues are very serious. If CBP turns back an order made with forced labor, we don't want it to go to Canada or Mexico or the UK. I think there have been recent conversations at the EU level about what's possible, and we are encouraged by that, and we encourage the US to use its diplomatic relationships to encourage reciprocity and or similar laws similar to the Tariff Act in other countries, as well as to engage more deeply with Mexico and Canada, our partners under the USMCA, about what's possible, including the evidentiary provisions and how to coordinate even more closely.
Thank you. Ms. LeBaron, I know that we can learn a lot by approaches that might have been taken by other countries. And to address this, I wondered if you could speak to what other countries are doing to combat forced labor in their supply chains, what you've seen, the benefits or the drawbacks of those approaches that have been, and what we can learn from that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman. That's a really important question. I think the first thing to say is, as I mentioned a moment ago, the dominant approach has been transparency legislation. That legislation differs across different jurisdictions in terms of its stringency, its coverage across the supply chain, whether there are penalties, how it's enforced. What we see is that where that legislation is very stringent, where there's strong enforcement and strong penalties, it can have an important impact in shaping corporate behavior relevant to forced labor, but that where it does not, it can just spark disclosure but not actually change anything. So companies report, oh, we're auditing, we're certifying, but as I said in my testimony, that's not solving the problem. So these WROs, I think, are really important in giving some serious state power behind action that is actually sparking new reactions from businesses.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. And your interest in multilateral approaches, I think, is really important. And look forward to exploring those with you. Congresswoman Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Nunes. And thank you to all y'all for being here as witnesses today. I want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues. Forced labor should not and cannot be tolerated in our global supply chains. Forced labor is not only dangerous, but it also goes against the very foundation of our American values. And I'm glad that Congress has taken a swift action to condemn the forced labor at every possible turn. Truly, this is a bipartisan human issue that we can work upon together, and we are, and I'm really glad. We must continue to use all trade tools at our disposal to combat forced labor around the globe. Section 3017, our FTA negotiations, and our GSP eligibility determinations as well. As we look forward to what the United States will need for innovation and advancement in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years and beyond, it's clear that we will require significant access and investment into critical minerals. We're all seeing this right now. Critical minerals are a part of our daily lives more than ever, and they're used in our smartphones, our computers, our energy. I think there's 1,400 chips in a car. So, it's everywhere. Wherever it's possible, we should try to mine these minerals here in the United States. When it's not possible, then we must ensure that supply chains for the minerals are not reliant upon forced labor. And I think one of the most egregious examples is cobalt, which is essential for the production of batteries. In 2019, the Democratic Republic of Congo produced about 70% of the world's cobalt supply. However, the DRC also relies on child labor to produce this critical mineral. That's unacceptable. We must do better. We must work with our suppliers to eliminate child labor and all other types of forced labor for their supply chains, and to ensure that the process laid out by Customs and Border Patrol are clear and enforceable. Ms. Ryerson, in your testimony, you discussed the use of child labor in West Africa's cocoa sector. Can you elaborate on any research that you or any nonprofits have conducted on child labor in mines?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. And I'm glad you're raising the issue of child labor in cobalt mines in the DRC. This is a very serious issue, and there is significant documentation that has come out recently, photographs and other information showing how severe this problem is. I think one really important distinction to make is that Section 307 addresses forced labor and forced child labor, but it doesn't address child labor that is not technically forced. And so that's a really complicated situation, because it means that a 7-year-old under the statute could consent to extremely hazardous forms of child labor. And so you'll see this in the cobalt sector in the DRC, where a lot of these children might not meet the qualifications to be a forced laborer. But is it true that a small child could consent to do very hazardous forms of labor that are very dangerous and have long-term impacts on their health and welfare? So I think that's a real gap in the statute, and we need to see, not just for cobalt, but also for cocoa and other sectors, we need to see ways to address these very hazardous forms of child labor that don't meet some of these other qualifications, and so don't really have any legislative deterrent in the same way that we do for those cases that meet the ILO indicators of forced labor.
What steps can businesses take to either reshore their supply chains or ensure that their supply chains for critical minerals do not use child or other types of forced labor?
So businesses so far have been in a largely voluntary world where they get to make choices of what they do and report on that to the public through social auditing and these voluntary programs. We need to see businesses take steps. We really need to see government take steps to move toward a binding regime. I think that expecting business to continue to engage in social auditing and voluntary activities and for that to have an impact it seems ignorant of this long history that we now have of them engaged in these activities without making real progress. So I think that certainly if they were engaged in a mandatory human rights due diligence regime where they had to report accurately and there were consequences for failure to do so, there'd be a lot of steps that they could take. But until that's mandatory, we don't believe that that's going to be effective.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Congressman Byer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Nunes, thank you very much for doing this. Very important hearing, and I'm glad we're moving forward. Ms. Rosenbaum, 2 questions. You wrote about how we have banned all cotton from Turkmenistan, the CBP, but no known enforcement actions taken to date. Why no enforcement on that?
Well, I think that is a better question for CBP. I think we are, and there may be enforcement actions that have been taken that have not been made public, but this is part of the question and the need for both greater engagement with the agencies, with civil society and labor organizations, both during and after the WRO petitions are filed. I think that it's clear that civil society and labor organizations have been critical in providing on-the-ground information about what's going on in these sectors, and they're going to be critical going forward in understanding and making sure enforcement activities are effective.
Well, and as we know with the law, when you don't enforce the law, it tends to be ignored. But part 2 of that is, Department of Labor added Taiwan to his list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor. And Taiwan is a good friend to all of us, so we're good friends to them. They're very dependent on us. Are you seeing any impact on those fishing boats because of our action?
I think we're going to need more time to see and understand that. I think an important part of this hearing is that we must enforce the ban on forced labor equally against our friends and against others. And that's really important, and Taiwan is a good example. I do think we wish that the trafficking in persons report from the State Department had also reflected this work, and we have seen governments respond to downgrades in their trafficking in persons tier ranking. And so we would like to see, in addition to the Department of Labor's and CBP's important work in this area, the State Department also be consistent.
Thank you very much. Ms. LeBaron, we've talked about how the Europeans had developed mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. And you wrote about the differences between process measurement and outcome measurement. Do those European standards laws have that? And is there anything parallel working through our democracy right now to develop those same kinds of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation?
That's a great question. So we haven't seen the EU level due diligence come through yet, so we don't know exactly what will be in there. In some European countries, there is more and more of a focus in their national legislation on not just having companies report on whatever voluntary measures they've taken, but report on how they know that those are effective and what the actual substantive risks of forced labor are and exactly how they're being addressed. And so we're seeing, I think, a promising move towards the recognition that that's necessary, but it's not yet clear whether or not that will be in the European legislation, and business are, of course, very opposed to that being in there. And so I think US cooperation around that is important. I'm not aware of any legislation in the United States that's seeking to put that forward in the US, but that would be certainly something that would be worth doing, in my opinion.
And you're talking to the right committee. Ms. Ryerson, you talked about how forced labor is excluded from the Department of Labor's methodology. That almost sounds like not possible. Can you expand on that? Why would that be the case?
That's a great question, and is maybe a question asked the Department of Labor. I will say we did have some conversation with some of the individuals involved in drafting the report and got the sense, or they gave us the sense that the primary reason for that is just how difficult it is to document forced labor, particularly in an industry with dispersed smallholder farms. going out, I'll say our own investigators who spent a lot of time, I myself have spent a lot of time in rural Cote d'Ivoire, speaking with farmers and tribal leaders and trying to identify which children were trafficked and which were not. It's really complicated by this fact that I was just discussing of this sort of very extreme hazardous child labor not meeting the standard. And so while you might have a child whose family is the next village over, they might be engaged in really hazardous forms of labor, they're alone on a farm, you walk up to them, they might not even speak the local language, but it's possible they're not actually a forced laborer. And so that makes it really hard. So the methodology would be dramatically different to do a forced labor investigation. That said, I think it's really important that government invests in these kinds of studies because it's very difficult to get comprehensive sector-wide data on forced labor, and government's uniquely situated to do that. So I would hope that in the future, the Department of Labor could commission studies that would include this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next, Congresswoman Sanchez.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, for the opportunity to really focus in on this very important issue. And I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. My highest priority when we talk about our trade agenda has always been to try to ensure that we put workers first, and that means both at home and abroad. And that means we have to promote transparency in our supply chains to make sure that we have enforceable negotiated labor standards and that we work together with our allies, particularly to combat problems such as the one that are being highlighted today. Because all workers, all people should be able to live their lives with dignity and respect. And when it comes to forced labor, clearly we must do more. As our expert witnesses have testified, forced labor is unfortunately far too pervasive around the world and across many, many different industries. And forced labor is just deplorable. No human being should be forced to work through intimidation tactics or under threat of violence. In addition to violating basic human rights, forced labor undermines efforts to help workers everywhere, and it impacts domestic workers. So by depriving workers of their labor rights, countries and corporations, and I think it's really important that we say that, corporations profit from exploiting those who are most vulnerable, and that undercuts worker protections all over the world, and it creates, quite frankly, a race to the bottom. We can so easily lose the progress we've made over the past century if we don't keep up the fight to protect workers. I've spent my life, my career actually, fighting for the right to organize as a member of IBW and then in Congress as co-chair of the Congressional Labor Caucus. And we have to really get our hands around the inhumane labor practices that also may not quite meet that definition of forced labor. For instance, it's long been noted that there is violence against workers in Central America that's been documented for years. Workers in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador face threats to themselves, to their families, physical attacks. Something that's all too frequent is gender-based violence and even murder of trade unionists. The International Trade Union Confederation has reported that the Northern Triangle countries are in the top 10 worst countries for workers over the last decades. So there are, just so many issues that we really need to wrap our hands around and to find solutions for. I want to start with Ms. Misra. What factors leave migrant workers especially vulnerable to forced labor and poor working conditions?
Thank you so much, Representative Sanchez. That's such an important question. And the answer to that question is that the global migration management system has created practices that leave migrant workers vulnerable. So for example, the predominant form of legal migration that we see around the world, whether it's the kafala system in the GCC countries or our guest worker programs in the United States, creates a system where worker visas are tied to a particular employer. So when workers do try to exercise their agency, when they speak out about inhumane conditions of work, etc., they are easily detained and deported for speaking out and retaliated against, blacklisted, so they can't come back. We've created a system that allows suppressing of worker agency in supply chains. The other big thing is that migrant workers often have to pay recruitment fees, again, often legal in the countries of origin, to come work in the United States, to go work in Qatar or other countries where they have these temporary migration programs. And workers should not have to pay for the privilege of working. Instead, they should be paid a fair wage for that. And what happens when workers have to pay recruitment fees is that they end up in debt bondage. And so one of the recommendations we've made to Congress for more than a decade now is to pass legislation that regulates these labor recruiters and prohibits them from charging recruitment fees, but also the employers that use these recruiters. And we've seen this in poultry factories in Ohio, for example, where there's been high incidence of forced labor, that the employers have to be held accountable for the actions of their subcontractors, of their labor recruiters. And that would go a long way to helping reduce forced labor against migrant workers.
Thank you so much for that answer. Ms. Rosenbaum, how does the lack of clear and transparent evidentiary standards make enforcement less effective?
I think that's really important. And I think some of the discussion that you've seen between my co-panelist, Mr. Lowry, and some of us is raising that up. And it is important to have anticipated standards, but it's also very important that the enforcement be real and concrete and disincentivize action immediately and have real consequences. So I think I also wanted to say, in relation to your very important points about Central America and labor abuse, as we look to an administration that is expanding investments in Central America to address the root causes of forced migration, it's going to be very important that we're having attention to forced labor and other labor exploitation on the spectrum of exploitation, including looking at development finance, looking at corporate investments and other things from the very beginning.
Right. Super.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how much time I have left, but I will yield back.
Well, it's all gone, so it worked out just right.
Perfect timing.
You bet. Congressman Arrington.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, panelists. Seems like we ought to celebrate every opportunity to where we have bipartisan agreement. We're all against forced labor. It's deplorable, and I think America has a moral responsibility as the leader of as the superpower and leader of the free world to hold other nations accountable for this. Now, here's my question, and I haven't asked the chairman this or talked to him about it. And this might not be even something that's comfortable to talk about among the industries that I represent. I represent a lot of ag and energy, and very proud that West Texas does a lot to contribute to our food supply and fuel supply. But my question is, to what extent is our moral obligation, in trade, in the context of trade? What is that moral responsibility and obligation to hold countries accountable? Because I think about China, and they're a huge market. And, if we're going to, if China's going to be supplied with products, I just assume they're supplied with American products for a number of reasons, not the least of which, I don't want our competitors to benefit from the largest market. That said, above and beyond, or maybe not above and beyond, but beyond just forced labor concerns, there are innumerable human rights violations. I mean, is the religious liberty rights throwing people in prison because of their faith, and political persecutions and freedom of movement and association, wrongful imprisonment for all the above? And what is our 10 commandments of how we shall address these in the context of trade? Because I'm against forced labor, and I'm against everything else I just said, and how you balance the sort of accountability sort of leadership role with the opportunities on the economic strength and prosperity side, which strengthen America's security and leadership in the world, which means we can advance freedom and American values. I'm not saying I have the answer to this. This is really a philosophical question for everybody on the panel. But I'll ask Brian Lowry if he would comment. I mean, do we need to go beyond forced labor, or is it just forced labor we care about? I mean, it seems like if we went through the entire list, we might not do any business with China. We didn't even mention the pandemic and their recklessness in contribution to that on life lost and the trillions of dollars spent. So I'll stop there, Brian, unless I start ranting, but help me wade through that.
Well, thank you, Congressman. You've raised a very important issue. I think this hearing is focused on forced labor. It's what we're talking about in the current context. But the issue of human rights, the violation of human rights, the disrespect of a human being has been around for centuries. It clearly is not an easy problem to solve, but it's one that does take our attention. It warrants our efforts and our resources. As I said earlier in my testimony, we really do support the efforts to prevent, identify, and eradicate forced labor globally, and we applaud Congress's bipartisan commitment for the implementation of those efforts. And we support the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and the International Labor Organization's Tripartite Declaration. But at the end of it, they're words, and what we need is action. One of your colleagues, I think it was Congressman Sanchez, said, we're creating a race to the bottom. That's an unfortunate environment, and it's not where we should be leading. Racing to the bottom is not a leadership position that we should take. And so I'm in alignment with you, and we need to look at human rights writ large, and we need to look at what we can do across the board, not just in one space.
Well, I'm open to working with my colleagues on that broader list, because if we put withhold release orders for forced labor, and we probably aren't even doing that effectively, from what I understand, then I'd like to know if we're doing anything in that same vein for all these other things. And I know that's not popular even in West Texas, probably economically, but that's how I feel as a human being and as a member of this great country. So thank you, Chairman.
Terrific. Thank you very much, and we look forward to exploring that. And Mr. Lowry, your point about the race to the bottom is something that none of us want to be on, and I look forward to continuing to explore this. Mr. Boyle.
There we go. I think I'm off mute now. First, I just want to say thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I've really learned a lot over the last couple hours and in reading each of the witness statements beforehand. The second thing I want to say is, for several of the witnesses we have, I'm just in awe of the work that you do and what you bring to this highly important and idealistic endeavor. So I thank you for the work you do, and of course taking time to be with us. I wanted to just drill, representing Pennsylvania, a state known for a lot of candy and chocolate companies, and that's something we're typically proud of. But I did want to focus on that aspect of forced labor. And I'll direct this to Ms. Rosenbaum. Is it accurate that right now no chocolate companies in the U.S. can guarantee their products were made without forced labor?
I might pass that question to Ms. Ryerson, if that's appropriate.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Ms. Rosenbaum. That's not exactly accurate, but it's pretty close. So all of the big chocolate producers, the big name brands that we buy at major grocery stores, that is true, if they're sourcing from West Africa, and certainly that would include Hershey's, I'm sorry to tell you. There are a few companies that are doing more serious supply chain due diligence that goes beyond some of these sort of standard social auditing and certification programs that are not importing with forced labor. But those are really a small percentage of the market. Every major brand certainly is doing so.
What would your opinion be then on proposed legislation that would require companies to trace essentially their supply chain?
I think that would be essential. We need these companies to be providing farm level transparency data right now, and they're able to do it. There's a lot of claims that there's only a certain percentage of their supply chains that are traceable, but they're quite capable of tracing their supply chains and releasing that data publicly. And I say publicly because we really need a lot of different actors to be working together to effectively stop this practice. And that means government and civil society and industry all have a role. And so if civil society and local organizations on the ground, and including farmers, don't have a sense of where cocoa is being sold, of how the supply chain operates, it makes it very difficult to combat those kinds of practices. So binding legislation would be very, very welcome.
Yeah, and on the same point, and again, specific to the cocoa industry, are there other measures that that you would recommend while we're on this topic? You know, the coordination group can do, for example, again, to eliminate this horrific immoral practice of child labor?
I think there's a lot of things that can be done. The Tariff Act Advisory Group has put forward the idea of an emergency fund. And so if we were to use more sort of strict liability tools like Section 307 to block imports, there could be an emergency fund put in place to try to shield some workers, farmers, trafficked children from the direct impact of that. Ultimately, though, what I would really hope is for CBP and for Congress to think about how CBP can use their leverage flexibly and to try to identify civil liability strategies that would be available. If you look at the Doe v. Nestle case, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just in my my time remaining, I wanted to shift. Thank you. I wanted to shift gears to Ms. Misra and just ask, you know, given the two, it's very timely, right? Given the two recent Supreme Court cases, if we were to shift from the legislative side to the judicial side, where do things stand now in terms of, you know, attempting to seek relief there?
Thank you so much, Congressman. And actually, Charity's more of an expert on the legal. I'm sorry, we keep turning to her, but I will just say one of the things that we've seen from the Supreme Court right now, and we hope Congress can respond to, is holding corporations accountable for their practices abroad, and we've seen there's definitely going to be a legislative need for that. But Charity, or Ms. Ryerson, if you want to address that more specifically.
Yeah, the real limitation right now is that extraterritorial application of U.S. law has been significantly limited by this series of cases, and not just in the Alien Tort Statute, but more broadly. And so until we have specific legislation that makes these kinds of standards extraterritorially applicable, we're not going to be able to use U.S. courts to get remedy for victims, even where a U.S. company was complicit or engaged in the harm that affected them.
Well, thank you. You were the star of all of my questions, it turned out. So thank you, Charity, and thank you again to all the witnesses.
Thank you.
Back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boyle. That's very helpful. And no hearing would be complete without hearing from Long Island. Congressman Sassi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is such an important hearing. Thanks so much for doing this. There's been tremendous momentum in our country and throughout the world of focusing on the Uyghurs. And I think it was really a brilliant idea to bring this issue of forced labor in so many different areas on top of the Uyghur issue. The issue of the cocoa production in West Africa, the palm oil in Malaysia and Indonesia, the seafood throughout Asia, sugarcane in the Dominican Republic. These are all such important moral questions that we faced, important economic questions that we face. Globalization has really exploded over the past 20, 30 years, and we're dealing with the consequences of it as everybody tries to get the cheapest price. And it really has been a race to the bottom for a long time now to try and get it's all about the money, which, we're all capitalists. We like that idea of people being successful, but not when it's going to completely subvert the values of our nation and the world community. My concern is I don't want to lose the momentum on the Uyghurs. I want to make sure that, we have this momentum. It's well known, it's documented. We're building support with many of our allies, some of them a little more laggard than others. But we need to really push the idea of outlawing the use of any products from Xinjiang and put the onus on the Chinese Communist Party and the onus on the people that buy these products to prove that they are not being used with forced labor. This idea of us having to prove it ourselves and the onus being put on the government to figure out whether it's being used with forced labor, I think is a non-starter. So I think that all of these issues require prevention that we have to address over a long period of time for going forward. And then there's the issue of intervention right this minute with the Uyghurs to send a very strong message. And and one of the things that I've been thinking about is that, one of the biggest products to come out, and there's many products, but one of the bigger products to come out of Xinjiang in China is cotton. They produce 84% of the cotton out of China, comes out of that one region. And so where are we going to produce the cotton? Our companies are still going to need cotton. And if we say we're not going to buy it from Xinjiang anymore, there's going to be a big hole in the market, the prices are going to go up. Where are we going to do it? So in my mind, what we should be doing as a nation is trying to produce cotton in the Northern Triangle, because we've got other problems in the Northern Triangle. We want to get the economy moving in the Northern Triangle, and we've got to figure out whether it makes sense to produce cotton in the Northern Triangle. But then I heard someone testifying earlier about the use of forced labor in the Northern Triangle. So I'm going to ask the witnesses, any of the witnesses who wants to volunteer, is there anything you can tell me about the Northern Triangle and the use of forced labor in that region?
Thank you so much, Congressman. Is it okay if I jump in?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. And so I think the issue of underlying root causes in Central America is so important. And what we've seen there is a breakdown of democratic space in the sense of workers being able to exercise their rights to enforce core labor standards in the country. We've seen not just retaliation in terms of firing against workers who try to stand up for preventing indicators of forced labor, but actual violence used against workers in that region, and corporations, unfortunately, who are complicit in that violence. So if we focus specifically on helping governments in Central America and requiring corporations to ensure adherence to core labor standards, that would go a long way in creating conditions where we can actually have decent work for workers in Central America so that they're not forced to migrate. And then we can do things like produce, I think, cotton where there are decent work conditions for the workers. But it really is about governments not enforcing civic rights, including freedom of association, et cetera.
So Ms. Misra, if you could get me anything that's something I should read about the Northern Triangle and forced labor issues in that region, or any labor issues, I want to try and encourage a stronger economy in the Northern Triangle. I think that we have to have that as a public policy. And I think there's a perfect marriage to be made of saying, let's stop doing business in Xinjiang because they're doing these god-awful things with forced labor, forced sterilization, forcing people to eat pork when it's against their religion, forcing people to eat even though they're supposed to be fasting during a particular religious season. The whole world is starting to learn that this is happening. Let's attack that problem, but let's figure out where do we want to see that business replaced. So we need to encourage a stronger economy in the Northern Triangle, but I need to make sure we're not just creating a new set of problems in doing that. So anything you have in writing for me, I would really appreciate that.
Absolutely, Congressman, and I would love to invite you to speak directly with our partners and our staff who work in that region too. I think they would have a lot of really great ideas for you, but I will send you also background information.
Let's set that up. Let's have a conversation after this. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I see my time has expired.
Thank you very much, Tom. That's very insightful, and I think it's an important part of our consideration. I just want to express my deep appreciation for the engagement of the subcommittee, of our witnesses. I found it fascinating. Even after reading your testimony before, more came out, and I found it, frankly, inspiring. Mr. Lowry, I look forward to working with you, refining some of this going forward. I will tell you that I am keenly interested in our being able to move against business models that are based on exploitation further down the supply chain, things that are going to be virtually impossible to enforce if we don't have accountability, moving past the first or second tier of the programs that some of our name brand partners are involved with. But then as it gets deeper into the supply chain, things get fuzzy. And at some point, it almost demands people sidestep, be involved with forced labor or other questionable tactics. I love the consensus that's emerging dealing with the fisheries. I think that this is something that we can work together on, make some progress, and it touches so many things ranging from climate change to health, slavery. It checks all the boxes. I'm going to request that the committee circulate to each of our members the Economist article that Congressman Panetta referenced from October 2020. I remember reading it. I meant to clip it. I don't know where it is, but I think it really sets the stage in sort of a jarring fashion. We've got our work cut out for us. We will look forward to further things that we will be doing in the fall. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions that you folks might consider answering later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record, which I think, again, was just one of the best hearings I've been privileged to participate in. I appreciate what our witnesses did and appreciate the engagement of our members, making it such a constructive effort. And with that, the committee will stand adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.